This section comes with a bit of co-requisite viewing because direct light and diffuse light are such a big subject. And I have a YouTube channel, you might know, youtube.com/marcobucci, and I've done 2 extensive videos on this subject that I would like you to watch as well as the content in this chapter. So if you go to my YouTube channel and click on videos, and just scroll back into my archives a bit, there's 2 videos. Part 1 is this one, entitled Ambient Occlusion and Ambient Light for Painters. Ambient light is also called diffuse light. This is the same thing. This is part 1. Then when you're finished with that, scroll up a bit and look for part 2, which is called Understanding Shadow Colors, Ambient Light Part 2. These 2 videos taken together are 45 minutes long, and it's like a whole extra chapter. I mean, I could have easily put these videos in this lesson instead of releasing them for free on my YouTube channel. But they are relevant to this lesson, and instead of repeating this information, I put a great deal of effort into those 2 presentations, so please watch them as well. I will be revisiting those concepts, but also demoing further about them in this chapter. And the first thing we're going to do is look at this 3D object here. It's a box-like object, just like the head. It's made of very simple planes, and it's being lit right now by a direct light. One of the key characteristics of a direct light is that it's a very hard type of light. When I say hard, I'm mostly referring to hard edge and clearly delineated values. For instance, if you look at the cast shadow where my mouse is pointing right now, see how it's got a pretty hard edge? Also look at the cast shadow on the floor. It's got that hard edge to it. This is similar to like a sunlight effect. The sun is also a direct light, which means it's also a hard light. The sun will produce very hard-edged delineations of light and shadow. Another quality of direct lights is that they are singular points in space. If you look at my light source here, this light icon, it's represented by a very small circle. That is a point in space. Because light is only emanating from that narrow point, the areas of the object that light can hit are very specific. For instance, the light can hit where my mouse is pointing here, but it cannot hit where my mouse is pointing there. The slightest change, like that's not a big change. There's like 100% direct light there, 0% direct light there. That's a quality of direct light. It comes from a small point, and it's very hard light as a result. Now you might think the sun is a very large object, and it is, but its location in relation to the Earth is very, very far away. So for all intents and purposes for us, the sun is actually a very small point in space. Just like this light here. This light is pretty emblematic of like sunlight. Direct lights like this also illuminate planes very clearly. Like this plane is clearly getting a lighter value than this plane here. This is the same thing I talked about in the Asaro head painting a few chapters ago. But diffuse light opens up a whole different world of lighting. And I can turn this light into a diffuse light right before our eyes here. Watch the light source. I'm going to increase its size. See this? I'm making the light more like it's coming from a giant card rather than one point. And now look at our object as it updates. You notice that hard cast shadow is basically gone. It's slightly darker there, but the light is able to infiltrate these areas because the rays are coming from a broader area. And I'll just adjust my view here so you can see how big I made that light. It was going off screen a little bit before. So instead of light rays only coming out of this one dot, now light rays are coming from this entire card. So where before no light rays could hit where that cast shadow was, now some of these light rays, not all, but some, are able to get at it because they're coming from a bigger area. In fact, in 3D programs, diffuse lights are called area lights because they span an area like this. And when you're walking around day to day in nature, chances are you're going to be seeing a combination of direct light and diffuse light. Here's a photo of a plant that I have in my house. And the lighting is very clear. We have sunlight coming in from the window, coming in this way, and it's striking the pot. Let's just look at the pot area for now. It's striking the pot in a very classical hard light way. I mean, look at that hard edge responsible for dividing light and shadow. The fence line, as I called it earlier, the fence line between the light family and the shadow family, extremely hard edged. Look at the hard edge of the shadow that's being cast by the planter. But there is also a diffuse light at play here, and it's this area of shadow. In nature, shadows are dominated by diffuse light because, as you've seen hopefully in my YouTube videos, that is the realm of ambient light. That is where you have a lot of bounce light. So in this case, you'll have sunlight coming in like this, very directly, like parallel lines. And they'll strike the floor and the wall and the grate and who knows what is in the scene. And they will start bouncing around. And it will appear random because there's so many light rays. There's, a billion light rays maybe. They're all bouncing around. It appears like the bounce light comes at random directions. And because the bounce light is coming from so many directions, what we get in the shadow is a very soft light kind of thing. In other words, a diffuse light. Diffuse lights are a bit harder to paint. You notice it's like a little bit darker there, a little bit lighter there, a little bit lighter also there, and different colors too. Like here we're getting like influence of the orange floor color. Here we're getting some bluer color. Here it's some kind of mix of the two. So diffuse light can be tricky to paint because we have to consider the entire area that light comes from. Whereas comparatively, a direct light is actually quite simple because a direct light is predictable. It only comes from one spot. A diffuse light, because it's coming from a larger area, is able to kind of wrap around objects a little more and light them more broadly. Again, please watch those 2 YouTube videos for a deeper dive on those few sentences that I just said. I'm purposely leaving room for you to watch those videos. Okay, here is the reference we'll be painting from in this section. I consider this a difficult piece of reference to work from, to produce a good painting from, for 2 reasons. One is it's heavily lit with diffuse light. Also, it combines direct and diffuse light. Now, this photo is the result of some high-budget Hollywood photography. So what the artists are doing here, the art directors on set, is they're kind of simulating nature, much like a stage director would do, as we saw in the last section. The lighting directors here are simulating a kind of sunset look. And just like we saw with my plant in my house, the sun is a very direct light. In this case, it's coming in kind of from below, like diagonally up into the scene. Remember, parallel lines, so it's going to hit only the planes that face it directly. And we can see that. It's all these side planes of the head, you know, the jaw plane, the side plane of the chin, the side plane of the brow, the part of the zygomatic that faces the side. All these side planes face that sunlight, and the sun is hitting them, or the lighting that they're using on set, which simulates the sun, is hitting the model with that predictable sort of hard edge. You can kind of trace that termination line, that fence line between light and shadow here. It's got a fairly hard edge to it. Not pixel hard, but hard enough for us to kind of easily draw a line. We can delineate that shape, no problem. But that's like 1/16 of the face. This entire part of the face is lit with diffuse light. And you're probably familiar with what diffuse lights look like on like a film set. They're like this kind of thing. There's these lights called Kinoflows. That's the one brand that I know of. And it looks like this. Remember in 3D, I had that card drawn out for my light. Well, it's the same thing. It's like the light is coming from this rectangular area. And those light rays can emanate from that large area and be responsible for illuminating more planes than a simple direct light could. And again, because the light rays are emanating from a larger area, it's more apt to create softer edges, which is precisely what's happening on this model here. So when I'm looking at diffuse light, be it in nature or in a photograph like this with on-set lighting, it doesn't matter. What I look for the most is where that light card or that diffuse light, where is it generally coming from? For instance, is the diffuse card placed up here, shining down this way? Or is the diffuse card placed down here, shining up this way? Now, when we're analyzing nature, the answer to this question is usually pretty easy. Usually it's the sky that's providing the most diffuse light because the sky is such a big area of light. Again, see my YouTube videos for more on that. And in this photograph, I'd probably wager that the art directors are trying to simulate a natural light. They're just kind of heightening it for filmic effect. So they probably decided to place a diffuse light somewhere above her, like way off screen, obviously, but somewhere above her, scattering light rays down this way. And the reason I know that is because all you have to do is look at her face with our knowledge of the planes. For instance, the cheekbone planes here. We know that this is a general area that points up, right? The cheekbones point up. As do the planes on the front plane of the nose here. These also point up. And same with the planes on the top plane of the chin. They also point up. And I can just visually see that those planes are lighter. So even though the diffuse light is much softer, there is still evidence of its general direction. And now that I know that, I can take the next logical step, which is to say that the planes that point to the side, for instance, the jaw here, that does not point up. That kind of points this way. It's not going to get as many of those diffuse rays. It's still going to be available to some of the rays, because again, a diffuse light comes from a broad area. So this is still lit by that diffuse light, although most of the diffuse light's rays are concentrated on the planes that point up. They're available to like all of the diffuse light, whereas, you know, some of the side planes of like the jaw, some of the side planes of the chin are available to, you know, a fraction of the diffuse light's rays. So they're going to be a little bit darker. Now there's a third thing, and that is ambient occlusion, and I hope you've watched my YouTube video about this. The area of ambient occlusion in this photo, there's two. The main one is directly underneath the hat. The hat is causing a very tight space. You can imagine that very few light rays are going to be able to bounce into that hat area. Despite the fact that a diffuse light is very large, very few light rays are going to be able to get in there. So we see a general darkening. And you notice the further up you get to like the crevice of that hat, where the hat meets her head, the darker the values get. Let me just get rid of those arrows. You can see the value gets much darker in there. And as it progresses down the head, that ambient occlusion area gets lighter. I would still say that if I were to draw the entire area of ambient occlusion, I would say it's like this. The ambient occlusion looks like this. That's the shape of ambient occlusion. But closer to the bottom of that shape, the values get lighter because the light rays are less occluded. A light ray could more easily find its way here than here. So you can see how diffuse light kind of takes a lot of, a lot more analysis, let's say, than a direct light, which is kind of either on or off. Whereas diffuse light, you have various degrees of light. And again, that's what's going to make this painting particularly difficult. But we will persevere, and I'll explain my process as I go. So here we go. I'm going to duck my reference in there on the right. I apologize that the hat's getting cut off, but the hat is not the most important part of this anyway. And I'll just do my sketch on the left. So I'm going to block this in. I'm going to go back to my line drawing and just put something in that's going to help me, because the other tricky part about this model or this reference is that there's a slight tilt to the head. Like the eyes are not completely horizontally aligned. Well, I mean, they are, but the head is tilted. So two-dimensionally, her left, the eye on the left is a bit lower. The eye on the right is a bit higher. So I'm putting in some general marks that will help me get there. And like I always do, I pick and choose the planes that are the most friendly to me, and that's just based on experience. You'll probably have noticed by now that I tend to like the nose a lot. Just for me, it's a kind of an easy geometric shape to draw, and it's got clear front and side planes, and whenever I have objects that have that, I'm more apt to get them right. So I usually do start with the nose. The nose is also, it gives me that dividing line between the brow line and the chin, right? It's that halfway point. So I like to start with the nose. And I'm using that funnel shape of the head to kind of block in an overall shape direction here. The glabella leading up to the eyebrows, I'll use that rhythm. And the eyes themselves are just making sure they're placed about an eye width apart. Again, I'm using those triangular measurements that cross the wing of the nose. You notice I'm a bit off here, so I'll adjust where the mouth is, I'll adjust where the nose is, just kind of moving things down a little bit so I am accurate with that. Now, in terms of representing different ages in your drawing, the model here is obviously younger than all of the reference we've been looking at so far. She's like a young teenager maybe. The planes are all the same. The proportions are even all the same. The difference is the softness between the planes. Like you can imagine think of like a rugged mountain man you think of like generally pretty hard edges on those planes, kind of like the Asaro head itself. Whereas, generally females have softer transitions of planes, and kids, and including teenagers in this case, have even softer planes. So think of a baby. There's no hard edges on a baby, right? And a teenage person is kind of that in-between phase between a baby and an adult. They still have that evidence of soft-edged youth, let's say. I'm not dealing with the soft-edged youth right now. I kind of actually want to make her face look a little bit harder edged in terms of its planes, because that's how I can better understand it. But then in the painting, that's where I'll take full advantage of soft edges and stuff like that. So you notice I've got my drawing in there in a way that is constructionally sound, and it's just a starting point. Again, I'll emphasize that I don't like to get everything. I don't need to get everything perfect up front. Not that I'm looking to make mistakes up front, like I'm checking my measurements here, as you can see, but I'm not too hung up with getting everything perfect. Okay, let's go into some color here, and I'll break down this as I go. This is similar to what I did on the previous painting, but the diffuse light is generally a cooler light in this case, which is true of nature as well. If you've seen my Understanding Shadow Colors video on YouTube, a lot of ambient light from the environment is cooler because a lot of it comes from the sky. And you can see it on this model. The light in the shadow, the diffuse light in the shadow, is very blue purplish. So I'm going to use blues and purples in the shadow. I'm not showing you my color picker because it's not important what colors I'm picking. I'm doing this as an exercise here. I showed you my color picker before. Now I'm hiding it because I don't want anyone to be fixated on the color of the pixel I'm picking. What matters is that it's warmer or cooler. And we'll see how I build up these colors in a moment. I mean, look at the colors on her face right now. They're so ugly, right? There's nothing nice about that. I'm giving myself a bunch of options, and I'll hone in on the singular sort of family of cools I'll use as I go. When I say family of cools, am I going to bias my cools to the blues, to the turquoise, the cyans, or to the purples? Which one am I going to bias the most toward? I'll find that later. Right now, I've given myself kind of equal doses of green blue and purple blue and all kinds of stuff, and it doesn't look good yet, but that's okay. Color doesn't matter as long as your values are good. And right now my values aren't there yet either, so I have a lot of work to do. I'm getting in a bit of that ambient occlusion. Remember that shape I described of the ambient occlusion? That's a key part of this lighting. Whenever you're dealing with diffuse light, you're gonna have ambient occlusion. So I'll get that in, and I have a basic shape there blocked in. It's giving me a sense already that the hat is resting on her head. And now I'll just like the ambient occlusion, I'll look at other planes that face dramatically down, like the underplane of the nose. I'll get another area of ambient occlusion that I forgot to say earlier. The second area of ambient occlusion is under her jaw, like where her neck is. That will also be heavily occluded and therefore much darker, which I have not blocked in yet, but I'll get there. But now I'm going to start working into the direct light. The nice thing about the direct light, and this is true of most direct lights in nature, there's only one direct light, the sun. Whenever you have sunlight, the sun is a very strong light, so it's going to just pop right out. In terms of its value, it's going to be a much lighter, stronger value. So I'm going to get that sunlight in there right now. You notice I'm using a relatively hard edge, and I'll just block it in. Not worried about perfection yet. I need to build relationships. So now I'm getting into the shadows, or into the diffuse light area, and I'm picking a bluish sort of color, and I'm aiming at the planes that are going to show me the direction of the diffuse light, which I've already described as coming from above, simulating a kind of skylight. So I'm just using my knowledge of the planes of the head. Which planes point up? Well, I know the cheekbones do. I know the top plane of the nose does. Here, this plane of the maxilla, like above the upper lip, I know that points up, so I'll get some lighter value on that. I'm making sure that this light value, though, is still darker than my direct light. The sun is the lightest value, so I got to keep that relationship. But in terms of the world of this diffuse light, the lightest values are hitting the planes that point up, because that is generally where that diffuse card is coming from. Okay, so that's what I'm doing here. And because the edges are so soft, that diffuse light is a large area, I have to be very careful with my edges. I can't light it. Like if this were a sunlight, I could just block out planes, like chisel them out. Here, the chiseling needs to be softened to a great degree. Here's some of that dark ambient occlusion on the neck, by the way, coming in, which pops the rest of the skull out from the neck area. All right, always a good idea to check your stuff in values as you go. And what I'm doing here, I'm actually painting in color, but looking at black and white, knowing that the color doesn't matter. I don't even know what color I'm picking here. I can't even see it because it's in black and white, but it'll look fine as long as the values are good. So sometimes I'll actually paint in black and white. A little bit of the warp tool, I had elongated her face vertically, I noticed. So I'm just bringing that down a little bit. Again, the structural integrity of the drawing will make this okay. This warp tool would not work. Like, you can't fix bad planes with a warp tool. At least not without some major surgery. But little adjustments are okay. I would rather just get it right the first time, but I did notice I was a little off vertically there. But that is one of the perks of the digital medium. You can do that for free. Just keep your eye out on the drawing whenever you do resort to things like that. Anyway, just building up these planes that point up, looking at the model, the reference on the right, and just looking at how those values are delineated. In general, like logically, the more strongly the plane points towards the area where the light is, in this case points up, the more value it's going to get. But because we're dealing with a soft diffuse light, those changes in value are very minuscule. So the training here, the discipline, is to train your eye to see subtle changes in value. This lesson, I've given you the reasons why it exists and where you can find it, but your practice is to do studies and train your eye to see small changes in value, and then link those with your knowledge of the planes of the head, because they are very linked. Like the jaw is going to be darker than the cheekbone in this case, and you can use the knowledge of the planes of the head to kind of predict that action, and then use your eyes to visually see it, and then link the two. A lot of art, to me, is a combination of those two things: your knowledge, which kind of enables you to predict how things are going to look, and then your eyes, which will hopefully will confirm your predictions, and then you can act on both of those accordingly. Now, sometimes, when you're learning, you'll think you know something, but then you'll actually see it in reference or from life, and it won't conform to what you think it should be. In that case, trust your eyes. Don't trust your knowledge, because your knowledge might be patchy. Your knowledge, the whole nature of knowledge is you kind of don't know what you don't know. And sometimes people can get real stubborn in saying, well, it should be like this, when it's probably more likely that there is actually a hole in your knowledge that you have to patch up. So again, if what you see in your reference does not conform to what your knowledge says it should be, trust your eyes, and then use that as impetus to continue your studies and, patch up whatever gaps might exist in your knowledge. That's what art learning generally is all about: unearthing those gaps that you didn't even know were there, and then act accordingly. All right, so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm using my smudge tool, which is one of my favorite Photoshop tools. There are smudge tools available in any package. They may not be called the smudge tool if you're using like Krita or something. I don't know what other softwares call them, but different apps have different kind of things. The idea is that a smudge tool allows me to kind of move the paint around as if it were like wet oil paint or something, or wet acrylic paint or gouache paint. It allows me to manipulate edges, and I can soften edges nicely with that tool. So a lot of my painting in Photoshop is done with the smudge tool. For those of you using Photoshop who would like to simulate my smudge tool settings, I turn on finger painting and I set the strength to about 95%. And then I prefer looking for flat brushes for my smudge tool use. They kind of act a little bit more like impasto brushes. I think the default in Photoshop is a round brush for the smudge tool, which doesn't really work for me. Anyway, just to take stock of where I'm at in this painting, I'm always trying to move forward in terms of presenting critical information in the painting. That's how I start paintings. In general, I think a painting should progress pretty quickly at the outset, because what you want to do is get all that critical information in, like where in this case, the direct light against the shadow in terms of its value and its color. And then within the diffuse light, we're getting that, that softness. Here, I'm just kind of working at the subtle planes, the side plane of the chin, the underplane of the jaw area, because the direct light is coming from kind of a lower angle. So it is going to hit the kind of where the jaw is turning into the underside. But I'm trying to present critical information first in my paintings. That is how you can progress in your work, like progress with a piece. And then you'll get to a point later in the piece where you can kind of slow down and evaluate little designs of shape and little changes in edge and modulations of color. But at first, I don't want to get caught up in that. It's not time for that yet. First, I got to get my planes right, my drawing right, my values right. And if you're focused on those efforts, your picture will progress very quickly. This is what makes it possible to do like a speed painting or something. Just get the critical information in. Or, you can go to a life drawing session like I mentioned in a previous chapter and do an oil painting from life in like an hour or something. As long as you're only shooting for the critical information and not dilly-dallying around with fancy brushwork or anything like that, that stuff can come later. Get the information down first. That is what will progress you the most. So I think this class is actually pretty good in terms of you can just kind of emulate the way that I'm drawing and painting here in your own studies. I'm showing you this as a way to study. And I'm showing you a few various ways of painting here. Like the last section was kind of more roughly done, and this one is a little more refined and little areas in between. You can emulate my process here in your own studies. Here, I'm just using my smudge tool to kind of carve out the top planes of the hat, like the brim of the hat is facing up. So it's getting more light, and you can clearly see that in the reference photo. And I don't want to get too crazy with the actual textures and patterns on the hat itself. That's not what this demo is all about. But I'll just block it in because the hat kind of looks blank, a little too blank there without any of that information. But I'll just use a bit of a quick texture brush. If you're looking for more information on brushwork, I have a whole separate class called Digital Brushwork Techniques. The nature of these classes is I want to stay focused. I don't want to get caught in this whole tangent on brushwork when I have a whole class about it. We're strictly aiming at the head here. In fact, I'm trying to tame down my brushwork. If you know my work from my online galleries, you'll probably notice that I go a little more crazy with brushwork in my, just daily personal work. Here, I'm being a little more controlled with it because I want to present a method of study that is more focused on analyzing the fundamentals. So I've adjusted my painting technique to be very straightforward. And then in your personal work, you can add all those little emotional flares, let's say. Like for me, it's a lot to do with brushwork and texture and how the paint is applied. That's something I look for in my own work. But that's not what I'm doing in this study. But again, if you want to learn more about digital brushwork application and just brushwork in general, yeah, I've got a different class about that. It's available now. So I'm working into the eyes now, and I've purposely kept this area pretty blank and very soft because it's an area of shadow and it's an area of ambient occlusion in particular. Now, remember, if you've seen my YouTube videos, ambient occlusion is not technically a shadow. This whole area is shadow. Ambient occlusion is simply the part of shadow that's the darkest, the most occluded from the ambient light or diffuse light. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to make it even softer in my study than it appears in the photo. In the photo, like the way a camera sees a scene, the camera is going to put kind of detail everywhere. And I don't want to be a slave to that. I want to use a painterly aesthetic to bring out the information where the most light is. This relates to something I said earlier in this class, where our eyes respond to light, not so much to shadow. Shadows tend to just play in a more amorphous kind of dark space. So I will soften my edges in shadow often, and I will eliminate information in shadow. And that's not just shadows, that's any kind of dark area. So in this case, we're dealing with a gigantic area of shadow. The entire face is in shadow, basically. But the ambient occlusion is the darkest part of the shadow, so I will eliminate the most information in the ambient occlusion area. Now, having said all that, I still will make those eyes a little sharper like I'm doing now. I'll bring them out with just a little bit more contrast in there, going in there with some slightly more dark values, slightly harder edges. But overall, I'm kind of taking this approach where I start something like this very soft in the darks, and then I'll little by little make it a little more contrasty and a little harder edged, just a little bit. I'm bringing that out as I go, and then I'll just I'll try to find the right place to stop and keep it still fairly subdued in the darks. Because even in the photograph, a lot of those edges in her eyes are becoming softer. Like I don't see a lot of hard edges there. So in my painting, I want to further exploit that kind of difference and caricature it really and make it even softer. So you can do that with any kind of thing with art. Like, for example, planes. If two planes have a difference in direction, you can exaggerate that difference. That's where like character design comes from, or caricature, which we'll actually touch on later in this class. You can apply exaggerated differences in values. If you notice something is lighter versus darker, you can exaggerate that contrast and make it even more so. Same with color. If you notice something is warmer versus cooler, like I'm doing here, I made the warm light a little warmer than it is in the photo versus the cooler light now by comparison is a little cooler. Like the difference is exaggerated in warm versus cool in my study here. And the same is true with edges. Again, hard and soft. If you notice hard and soft edges in your reference, you can exaggerate it. That's where your study uses your creativity and your imagination. I'm not trying to replicate this photo. Like the last thing on my mind is like getting a perfect likeness here. That's not what I'm doing this for. I'm doing my studies, and not just this study, but in studies in general, I'm doing it to capture relationships of all kinds. The more visual memory you'll have at your disposal when you're working, and you'll find that it'll come to the point where you probably don't even need reference for certain things anymore. Like if I'm doing a human character design, I probably won't need reference for it because I know the planes of the head. I know different lighting scenarios. I know about color harmonies and stuff like that. the utility of reference becomes less useful to you. Now, reference is always going to be handy for things that you have no idea how they look. Like, still on the head, sometimes if it's a really crazy angle, I'll need to look up some reference or take a quick photo of me or something in that pose. But all the time there are objects. Like I was drawing an airplane a few days ago, and I don't really know how an airplane looks, so I need reference for that. But with study of the fundamentals, in this case, head fundamentals and like planes of the head, you should be able to look at reference and get away from copying it. You should be able to look at reference and understand it. That is what your studies should be focused on. So whenever you're studying, be it from this class or finding your own photographs and doing paintings or whatever it is you're doing, try to distance yourself from simply replicating your reference. I think that's of limited use. It's okay to do. Go ahead and do it. But also remember that your studies should be aimed, in my opinion, more at capturing the relationships between things like value and things like changes of direction of plane, color, and stuff like that. Because those relationships are universal. Those are not just tied to one specific reference. In other words, you'll be able to use your knowledge of relationships on any subject. And what you learn on the human head can be applied to a human head, or it can be applied to drawing an airplane. The fundamentals, that's what's so beautiful about them. They're universal. They don't care about what subject you're painting. And I think the spirit of that can be lost if all you're trying to do is replicate your reference material. So in this case, instead of me, painting the cheeks and saying, okay, how exactly is her cheek formed? I'm thinking more about the plane, like what's the direction of the plane? Because if I'm thinking about planes, and no pun intended with the airplane example earlier, but if I'm thinking about planes, I can apply the concept of planes to any subject, not just this piece of reference. All right, getting back to another little technical note. When it comes to hard lines in a painting, you notice I really try and avoid them. There are certain areas of the face that will tempt you to make lines. For instance, the line in between the lips, like where the mouth is, in between the two lips, everyone is tempted to draw a line there. You notice I have not done that. The only lines that I can see, the two corners of the mouth have some heavier, darker marks that kind of look linear-like, but there's no line between the lips. And that's true of, like the nostrils. The way I've stated the nostrils is I've let the shadows be kind of softened. Same with the eyes. The eyes, the iris is kind of blending up into the upper eyelid, and those edges are soft, kind of blending up into the orbital area that they sit in. Features of the head, when you paint them, I try and do my best to exercise like soft edges there. There will be times when you want to use hard edges. Mostly it's to do with the light. Like if there is some hard direct light hitting an eye, you might get some hard edges because, hard light will starkly reveal very specific planes. But because we're painting this head in a diffuse light, the last thing I want to do is put a hard line down because it would kill the illusion of soft light. And just to show you what that looks like, a lot of people will do this. They'll put like this line between the lips. They'll draw the eyes with like a line. Because after all, you can see where this would come from. Like if you look at the eye, it does look like there are lines there, and they'll put another line here for the upper eyelid. But when you do this, you kind of are breaking away from the language of painting, which is all about variations of edge. And when you paint a head this way, you're really not painting it at all. You are kind of reaching some awkward mix between a linear drawing and a painting. Another common thing is people will over-define nostrils, like they'll start going in like this. And while this information can be accurate, it doesn't fit in the language of painting. Like you can see how awkward this looks, right? And I'm not just inventing this. I've taught, for many years, and I get student work that kind of looks something like this a lot, where it feels like the eyes are like stenciled onto the head, like someone took a Sharpie and drew them onto a piece of plastic. That's what it ends up looking like. Instead, go the other way. And you can even go softer than this. For instance, let me just do something real quick. I've just gone ahead and I've used some filters and stuff, a few brush strokes to make a super soft version of the head. I would say that this is better than what I had before with the lines, because this we're still revealing structure, and you don't need fine lines to reveal structure. Structure is revealed more in large plane changes, which we have here. Now, I think the edges are too uniform in this version, of course. But one thing I really like I really like how the nose is defined. Like, remember the 6 planes that were responsible for the underside of the nose? Yeah, I've just reduced it to 1. That is far more valuable to me than like showing the viewer exactly where the nostril is and where the septum is. It's like, yay, good for you. But who cares? Like, no one really cares about the septum and the nostrils. They just care that you, as the artist, know enough about it to give it to them in a way that is a little more artistic. As one of my favorite painters, Morgan Weisling, once said, no one is going to applaud your portrait for how well you painted the nostrils. Yeah, and you know what? I really enjoy this little version of the head. And by the way, the filter I mainly use for that is this angled strokes filter. You can see my settings there. It's actually good to break down photographic reference too. Just apply the angled strokes filter. It really reveals the planes. And, you can test your own painting against it. And just see that when Photoshop simplifies it, make sure that the structure of your planes are holding up. And then what you can do, you can even paint into this. Like if you wanted to bring a little bit of hardness now back into the eyes by just working in here and just finding a few hard edges popping out of the softness, then you can get a lot of interesting statements in your painting this way. That is certainly breaking free of the photographic reference and coming into the realm of concept art or your own level of expression. It's quite common for the iris to kind of bleed a dark value up into the upper eyelid, like right in here. So I'm kind of favoring the darks as it goes into the upper eyelid. Another common area for darks is the corner of the mouth. It's this little pocket of dark right in the corner, and it kind of dimples out into the lighter part. So it's a very soft value transition that you can use for the corners of mouths. You can maybe get that value ramping a little bit darker as it becomes a little more occluded. The light becomes a little more occluded as it descends into the corners of the mouth. These are very sensitive areas. If I wanted to show where the nostril is, I would do it in just a slightly darker value. Like as a general, I would just use the 2 planes there where the nostril lies, as we remember from chapter 1. And I would just kind of get them with a slightly darker value and not worry so much about the actual opening of the nostril. And get the nostril in a little bit, but I don't want to do that too much. Like I think that says nose just as much as I'd ever want to say nose. The nostrils are like the least flattering part of our face, if we're being honest. But that's not the reason I decide not to include them as much. The reason I'm not including them as much is because this is a diffuse light, and a diffuse light is soft. So I want to eliminate hardness from my painting and make the piece more revealing of the structure of the head more than any individual part. Back to the painting now, and you know what? Just for a lark, I took my angled strokes filtered layer and I, erased out a little bit of it on top of my original sketch. So what you're seeing here is my original painting plus some of the angled strokes filter, and I'm going to paint into this just to show you, these techniques are variable. You can use Photoshop to enlist Photoshop's help for some edge work. I think right now I've got, like I said, I've erased out of that angled strokes filter to reveal my sketch underneath, and I'll just work into it. Anything to keep those edge varieties up. One of the downfalls of the digital medium is that it's so easy to create repetition because digital brushes rely on algorithms, and no matter how hard you try, you're going to create repetition because it's the same math being computed each time you put down some brushstrokes. Whereas with like oil paint, it's organic, so it's different. So sometimes I'll use things like angled strokes in my painting, or the dry brush filter is another favorite of mine. Or I'll do I'll overlay textures, or I'll do all kinds of things to promote variety in the work. And now what the angled strokes filter is allowing me to do is it's kind of blurred out some of my original painting, and now I have the opportunity to go back into it and pull out hard edges again. So I'm kind of like doing a second pass into the edges. And this is something I find helpful, blurring something out or using a filter like this and then going back into the area. Sometimes you've probably seen artists do this with pencil. They'll do some kind of pencil sketch and they'll just smudge it away and work into those smudges. There's something about that when you can you willingly lose some of the work you've done, and then the act of bringing it back kind of forces you to refine your drawing as you go. I know a few illustrators who draw and redraw their work several times to give themselves the ability to kind of go back into the work, and kind of whenever you have to redo something, you're a little bit more familiar with the shapes you're making, a little more familiar with the edges you're making, and the act of doing it again usually improves the piece. I think Richard Schmid said this in his Alla Prima book. He was recounting one of his old painting classes, and he had done a successful portrait. The first thing his teacher did was ripped up his canvas and said, okay, do it again. I think that's a great way to learn. I've heard writers call it killing your darlings. Erase your work, or in this case, blur it out, and then go back in and get it back. That's a great way to develop discipline. I feel like it's like doing reps in a gym or something. Anyway, that being said, I think I'm finished with this study. This was a fun one to work on. Hope you enjoyed this. A lot of information in this section. In the next chapter, we'll do something a little different.